to have you all here. I'm really excited about this event. I was looking forward to it. I kind of pick and choose what events to go to, and this is a special one. So I made sure that I'm here with Ken Grossinger and Bill Fletcher, two great writers and friends. So I want to introduce them for a second. Introduce Bill first, who will be doing the interview with Ken. So I came to hear Ken and I got Bill, so I got a twofer, which is great. It's always wonderful to have both of them. So Bill is also an author. He wrote a book called The Man That Fell from the Sky, a great fiction book that deals with racism and all kinds of really interesting things. It's a mystery novel, a crime novel. So it's a great story. If you haven't read it, please do. Got great reviews. So Bill Fletcher, I met Bill when he was heading Trans-Africa many years ago. I had a small restaurant called Mimi's. Anybody remember Mimi's? Hey, a couple of people. All right. Great place. Anyway, I met him and we had a long conversation, and the issue came up about Palestine back then. And of course, the issue hasn't gone away. It's still very, very much right in front of us. Wonderful conversation about it, and I realize we're kindred spirits and really interested in social justice, not just as it relates to African Americans and the diaspora, but also as it relates to people in the Middle East, because what happens in Southeast DC impacts what happens in the Middle East. I'm convinced of that, and I think many people are also understand the interconnectedness of all of us when it comes to imperialism, social justice, or all those things. You've been consulting for social entrepreneurs, and it's been great to have him here with us. And of course, he's also known for union organizing. He's been doing that for quite some time. It's wonderful to have him and his wife Candace here. Where's Candace? Oh, there she is. Way in the back. So great to have you here, Candace. And Ken Grossinger. Ken, I've also known him for many years. He threw one of the best campaign fundraisers for me when I was running for office. Had some great fun people there. Robert Enright, the late Robert Enright was there, which was really exciting. But Ken has been a wonderful friend, and of course, someone I think that we agree on so many issues when it comes to issues of social justice. And of course, this article was really interesting. A lot of time art is seen as a just a fun thing to do or something just decorative, but art really has a huge impact on how we see the world, how we see each other, how we interconnected as human beings to one another. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about this, reading this book, so I can learn even more. I was invited years ago to go to an event in Sundance where they talked about the value of art, and every time we have to rehash that. And I know that every time that the city council comes out for their budget debate, art is always on the chopping block. It's one of the first things we end up cutting, and it should be the very last thing we end up cutting. They should start cutting them down the side. Things that really don't matter that much. Art is what makes us human. Art is what really works for all of us. I really appreciate all that. We also, he and his wife, Micheline, have a great philanthropic organization called Cross Currents, where they fund artistic endeavors that really try to change the world and make a difference. So it's really exciting to be part of that. Thank you all for being here. I look forward to this conversation. Take it away. So good evening. I want to begin by thanking Andy for so many things, for being a great friend, and for providing us with this opportunity to have this discussion, and also thank him for his courage. I want to emphasize two things in the beginning. First is buy stuff. Why do you need buy things? Get food, get drinks, run up the tab. Don't give the tab to me. So Ken asked me to do this discussion with him. Ken and I know each other for probably 30 years, close to 30 years. And I had no idea
Art and culture were never part of the mix. And when I practiced it, therefore, art and culture were never a part of the mix. And when I began to teach younger organizers how to think about organizing, I didn't teach it. And then I married an artist. And I realized just how big a boat I missed. And when Micheline and I started to collaborate through the Cross Currents Foundation, funding at the intersection of art and social justice, I learned that it wasn't just organizers that didn't think strategically about using art and culture in their work, but it was artists too that didn't think strategically about how to use their work in the service of social movements. And so the book is really designed in my head to function as a strategic document, to look at the history and to look at modern day examples of where art and organization have been able to join forces, where artists and organizers have worked together. When I say art, I mean it in the broadest possible terms. Film, theater, music, photography, painting. And I'd like to share two examples of collaborations between artists and organizers that illustrate some of the ideas in my book. The first photo is one that was taken by Danny Lyon. So I start the book with a discussion of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because in many ways, SNCC laid the groundwork. It was the predicate for a lot of the art and organizing collaborations that took place. You'll remember Jane Stenbridge, one of the first staffers that SNCC hired. She was a poet. I think the fourth staffer that SNCC hired was Bernice Reagan Johnson, who not only helped to start the Freedom Singers, but as you know, founded Sweet Honey in the Rock. And like many activists in the North, Danny Lyon, the person who took this photograph, went to the South to participate in the civil rights movement. And he met with James Forman, who at that time was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And James said to Danny, you need to find these girls. They're not 33 in this photograph, but there were 33 teenage girls who were protesting racial segregation in front of a movie theater, who was swept up by the police, put into the Leesburg stockade for 45 days. Their families didn't know where they were. They weren't actually arrested, they were detained. And James Forman thought that to expose the brutality of white supremacy in the South, we needed uncontestable visual evidence. And so he sent Danny to find these girls. And along with two civil rights workers who distracted the guards, Danny took this photograph through broken shard glass and bars. And it eventually wound up in the hands of Senator Harrison from Pennsylvania, who entered it into the congressional record. And thereafter, media started picking it up. You remember, or you know of Jet Magazine. Jet Magazine ran a long piece with it. And it eventually wound up on the desk of Robert F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States at that time. And these girls were swiftly released. So it was the idea that art is not just a reaction to or a reflection of social conditions and social change, but it is a contributor to them. It makes a significant difference. It can serve as a catalyst to social change. And I then want to give you a more contemporary example. I don't know if anyone has seen this mural before. It's You wouldn't see it. It's no longer up now. But this is a story that takes place in Baltimore. And it's about a collaboration between a housing organizer and an artist. The housing organizer was spending a lot of their staff time doing research about who owned buildings that were dilapidated and blighted, and hooked up with this guy, Justin Nethercutt. And Justin said to Micheline and I, before he started the project, we need to call attention to the blighted rows and rows and rows of housing in Baltimore. It's one of the last of the East Coast cities where you can still walk into communities and see nothing but burned out, empty homes. And so he said, what I want to do is pull together a team of 15 artists, and we're going to put murals up on each of these buildings. And I said, and I'm not the most diplomatic person in the world, but I said as diplomatically as I could, well, that's nice. It's going to draw some attention, but it's not really going to change anything. And then Justin said to me, yeah, but. And the but was that QR code up by the peak. So you know the Raven, the Baltimore Raven, and that's their colors. And so you've got a picture of a raven with wood slats in its claw and caution tape from the police hanging down from its beak, symbolizing the rebuilding of a home. And he said, when you scan that code, it takes you to a website and up pops the name of the slumlord who owns it. And so here's what happened. 2 days later, the mural was left intact, but the QR code got ripped down. No surprise. So Justin, being Justin, went back and put it back up. And you can imagine, and I don't actually know how long it takes to get a demolition license in Baltimore, but that building was knocked down in weeks, reflecting the power of landlords and realtors in Baltimore. So again, it's the notion that art is not just a contributor. I mean, art is not just a reflection or a reaction, but it is a contributor to social change.
So within progressive circles, there seems like there's been for a long time a real ambivalence around art and culture in the United States. I mean, just in my own limited experience in writing a novel, writing 2 novels, I've had very ambivalent responses from people, frequently implying that I have a lot of time on my hands, right, to be doing something so irrelevant. And so when I say to people, well, wait a minute, you know, you ever hear of Dashiell Hammett, right? You ever, Walter Mosley and Octavia Butler? And it's like people say, yeah, but, and then sort of it drifts off. So what's your reading in terms of why there's this ambivalence about culture? Why is it often treated as, at best, an add-on? Oh yeah, we need to have a poet, or let's have a song, you know, something like that.
It's really exactly why I wrote that book, because that's what a lot of people do. We need to embellish a little bit. We need to have a song or a poem or a piece of art to make things look good. But there is not a strategic thought about the role of the artists and what they can contribute beyond their art. And I think what we've encountered in terms of the question of collaboration and why it's not happening on scale is that there are fundamentally differences between the way artists think and the way organizers think. So metrics is one of the answers to the question, Bill. We know as organizers, we think about how many leaflets have been put out, How many phone calls have been made? How many mailers were there? How many people showed up at a demonstration? The assessment that artists make is a much more qualitative assessment. So you have a quantitative, qualitative thing going on. There's also a couple of other factors. There is a message control issue. A lot of social change organizations put tens of thousands of dollars, as you know, into polls. They want to figure out how to talk about the message. Well, the last thing an organization like that wants is an artist coming in who may or may not be interested in the poll, but has a commitment to the idea and wants to do some art. So there's a question of control. I also think there's a question of timing. Organizers want things done yesterday. They want things done today. They want things done next week. Artists have the same urgency in their desires to want change, but they think about change on a much longer horizon. Hank Willis Thomas said, to me, change happens over a period of 10, 20, 30, and 40 years. So those dynamics is what we're grappling with. And there are some ways to overcome those dynamics, which is just to have an understanding, a basic understanding. So if you're the League of Conservation Voters and you want to bring in an artist, the artist will spell out very clearly what it is they're willing to do and what they're not. And the League of Conservation Voters will say, we're in or we're not. So if you have sort of like an informal memorandum of understanding, which is how labor organizers think about this stuff, that works. That gets us someplace.
But, you know, here's the problem. So it seems to me that organizers, progressive organizers, I don't know whether the right is, we'll get to that later, but they think about art and culture in a very instrumental way. It's like, you can't just call in a painter and say, this is our struggle, come up with a painting. I mean, I don't think anyone sat down with Picasso and said, you know, we need a painting about what the Nazis just did in Guernica. So why don't you spend a little time coming up with something, right? So it's thinking very differently, which it seems to me means a very different relationship to struggle. And so I'm trying to figure out then, what does that mean about the active involvement of different kind of artists? I mean, sometimes I think it's like, no, you don't just like ask someone to come up with a poem. I mean, people do that, but you understand what I'm saying?
So can I move this to a discussion about narrative change? Because I think the narrative component, the narrative shift, the culture shift, if you will, addresses some of this. And I just happen to have a couple of slides I wanted to share about this. So this is a slide called Baby Kikito, and it was and this project was created by an artist named JR. JR is a French photographer and collagist, and he's known for making murals all over the world, from Palestine to London and you name it. And in the height of the Trump administration, when Mexicans, the vile language that Trump was using to define mechanisms were at its peak. When Trump was trying to institute, and did institute, a family separation policy, JR wanted to comment on that. And so this is an example, actually, of an artist that didn't go into a collaborative effort with a community organization, but wanted to comment on the times. So while my book focuses mostly on collaboration, it's important to understand that that's only one approach. And so JR made this photograph of this baby Kikito when Kikito was 1 year old, and took the photograph in his crib. And he asked his mother if he could blow up her baby's photograph and put it on the US-Mexico border. And so he blew it up 70 feet, propped up by plywood and scaffolding, with a couple of ICE agents looking up at the baby. And JR posted that on Instagram. 1 million people saw it almost, I don't know how quickly, but immediately. And people started coming from all over the world to see this. And so the narrative that Trump was laying out about Mexicans were offset by the humanity that JR was trying to express. And there's one other I wanted to share with you. Public monuments. I don't know if you saw the New York Times today in the opinion section. There's a big piece on public monuments that's worth looking at. As you know, in the height of Black Lives Matter, monuments became key targets. They were targeted for at least 2 reasons. One is because of what they represented, which is white supremacy, which is white Confederate generals looking down on people and forcing people to look up at them. And 2, because they were local. And so local activists had a clear target that they could go after to make their point. And what Kehinde Wiley did was flip the script on its head, pull down the white Confederate general, and in this monument called Rumors of War, put up a black horseman wearing dreadlocks and sneakers. So now if you're a kid walking by a monument, you can look up at a hero and not be looked down upon by a white supremacist. So it's an important point about narrative change and what's going to be necessary if we want to change our culture. I don't know if that got to it, but I hope it did.
Yes, thank you. You and I both spend a lot of time in organized labor, still are involved. And one of the pet peeves I've had is that labor seems to have a very stale idea about songs. So it's like you go to a labor event and conference or whatever, and you might have someone with a guitar singing songs from 1937. And I have this allergic reaction to that, you know? It's just, it's wait a minute, I mean, a lot of time has passed. I mean, all due respect to Guthrie and Seeger, a lot of time has passed. But there seems to be this obsession with that. It feels like it's frozen in time. Yeah. So why do you think things haven't evolved?
I think because our approach to social change is hidebound. And art and culture have never been fully embraced. And the power of song is so strong. I wanted to read, if I could,
yes,
a couple of small quotes about song, about the power of song, which doesn't answer Bill's question, but lifts it up as to, what, are we crazy not to do this? So this first quote, I'm going to read 2, they're pretty short, is by Wyatt T. Walker, who was the head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the Civil Rights Movement. And he was talking about the song, We Shall Overcome. And he said, one cannot describe the vitality and emotion this one song evolves across the Southland. I have heard it sung in great mass meetings with 1,000 voices singing as one. I've heard a half dozen sing it softly behind the bars of the Hinds County Prison in Mississippi. I've heard old women singing it on the way to work in Albany, Georgia. I've heard the students singing it as they were being dragged away to jail. It generates power that is indescribable. And then a guy named Bruce Hartford, wrote the following when he was asked about song in the civil rights movement. And he said, "For us, freedom songs were the psychic threads that bound the movement into a tapestry of purpose, solidarity, hope, and courage. The songs spread our message. The songs bonded us together. The songs elevated our courage. The songs shielded us from hate. The songs forged our discipline. The songs protect us from danger, and it was the songs that kept us sane." And so Bill's question is just right on target, as most of your questions usually are. And we've got to break out. We've got to figure a way to break out. And one way to break out is to look at examples of where this has worked and make the case as to why. So I've just recently been invited to 2 unions to talk about the book. And that, to me, is a milestone. Now, they're both very progressive unions, so no surprise there. But I've been invited in to talk about this for them to think about things in a different way, because what we're doing isn't working in the bigger picture. I mean, there's a lot of great organizing going on in the labor movement right now, all these wonderful strikes that are succeeding. There's organizing that's taking place. But in the main, I would say, we're not making the progress that we need to make. Banned books, anti-LGBTQ legislation, 2 wars, the list goes on, and I don't even want to get into the list because that will divert us to a whole different book.
But I think there's something else. There seems to be the lack of embrace of the evolution of culture. So just as an example, We Shall Overcome. I grew up at the tail, I was a younger Black Power person in the North. That song had very little meaning for me, right? It didn't resonate with my generation in New York. I don't mean that we opposed it. It's just that wasn't our song. And so when people hold that up, it's like that was a song that came out of the Black freedom movement at a particular moment, out of the South, had national implications, but the struggle evolved, and so too did issues of color. So culture. So the Last Poets, right? The Last Poets were a New York phenomenon. That was what I embraced. They were the prototype, for those that don't know, of rap. And people like Felipe Luciano from the Young Lords Party was one of the original founders, a number of other people. But it was like, that wasn't We Shall Overcome. That was, I'm not going to say it here, but that was something else, right? And it was like the movement, both the Black freedom movement as well as labor, seems to have had great difficulty recognizing that as the movements evolve, so too will the culture. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, so it sort of brings to mind this debate about whether or not political change is necessary to create cultural change, or whether you need cultural change first before you can make political change. And from my point of view, it's sort of like a moot question, because you need both, and they're interactive, they're iterative. There's no question about it. Politics and culture interact. And if artists don't embrace politics, and social change organizations don't embrace culture, then we're just on a treadmill.
So we're not the only ones that think about culture. The right wing does too. And there's a lot of struggle that goes on in the cultural realm between the left and the right. As a science fiction fanatic, I can tell you that it runs throughout science fiction in terms of battles around very different ideas about the future and the present. Things like Blade Runner, for example, versus Heinlein. And so how do you see the right, how does the right look at this issue of culture?
So I can testify that Bill is a sci-fi fanatic, because when we were at SEIU together, he used to go like that to me all the time. And I said, what the hell is he doing? I never quite got it until I learned that he was into science fiction.
The Vulcan greeting.
The Vulcan greeting, yes. So there is no question that the right understands the power of culture. The very first feature-length film made in this country was what? Birth of a Nation in 1915, shown at the White House, doubled the number of KKK members at its time. Fast forward to the Cold War, when the CIA had 3 seats on the Museum of Modern Art board in order to promote abstract expressionism as a counter to Soviet social realism. Fast forward to a couple of months ago, when at the very first Republican primary, Richmond, north of Richmond, was played. You all know that song? Yeah. So the right gets it, has been invested in it, and is promoting it. And they've got resources, but so do we. Look at what Norman Lear did. I mean, those of you, most of you in this room are old enough to remember All in the Family. I mean, this was the first time beaming into people's living rooms on their TV that race and LGBTQ issues were addressed. And so there is a fight on the left and a fight on the right around culture. It's our fight to win or lose.
So in your book, there's a number of things that you talk about. I'd like you to elaborate on film, on museums. I mean, the museum thing was really quite interesting. Not that the rest of the book wasn't, but no, it was not something I was really thinking about. Although it's almost like it's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
You know? But I want to ask you something about films and how you look at films, the use of films in social movements. And partly it reflects, when I was an education director in a couple of settings, SEIU and AFL-CIO, I would have filmmakers regularly come to me and say, do I have a film for you? And I would try to explain to them, we don't just show films at union meetings or something like that. And there was this complete absence of understanding the way unions work. It was just sort of, here, use this film, it's good. How have you seen film used successfully with social movements?
So I want to tackle this with the help, I haven't asked her to help me prior to this meeting, but with the help of Karen Nussbaum, who's here. I want to tackle this question by looking at 2 films that Jane Fonda produced. Jane Fonda had a production company called IPC. She made 4 or 5 films through that production company. And I want to contrast 2 of the films, because one film is really focused on the idea of lifting up an idea, individual transformation, consciousness, if you will. And the other idea is about marrying a movie to a movement. And so do you remember the China Syndrome? Mm-hmm. Jack Lemmon, Richard Dreyfuss, Michael Douglas, Jane Fonda. So it's a film about a reporter. It's a film about a nuclear generating station on the verge of a nuclear meltdown. And reporters get wind of this. And 10 days after the film comes out, 3 Mile Island happens. The largest exposure of radiation in this country's history. I think it was a 5 on a Richter scale of 1 to 7. Mm-hmm. And so the box office numbers were off the charts. The box office brought in 9 times more than the production cost of the film. And it lifted up the idea of corruption because the film takes a look at precaution versus profits. is it possible for a nuclear power plant to be profitable and also cautious? And the thing about this film, from my point of view, and others have argued with me about this, is that it wasn't really tied to the anti-nuclear movement. It was a film about nuclear energy and the risks associated with using it. And Ted Turner told Jane that it turned him around against nuclear power. So it had a lot of influence in terms of the way people think about it. But I want to contrast that, and here's where I'm going to ask for Karen's help, with a film called 9 to 5. So Lily Tomlin, Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda. Karen, I normally tell this story, but you're here, and I think you can tell it a lot better. So why don't you say a word or two about it?
Thank you. First of all, the artist, the really,
Thank you.
who the artist is really important. So Jane Fonda was both a phenomenal artist, but she was also an organizer. So her production company, IPC, stood for Indochina Peace Campaign, which is where I met her. And we were both organizers. She had a very different role than I did. In the Indochina Peace Campaign, while I was organizing clerical workers in an organization called 9 to 5. It was her idea to make a movie that would really explode the issues that we were finding, and that she believed there was an audience for it. And so the film works because it grows directly out of a movement. She and the writers met with 40 9 to 5 members in Cleveland one long night. These were all women office workers. And all of the details about the issues that the women faced and how they talked to each other and so on came out of that meeting, including the hook in the movie where late in the evening she asks, has anybody here ever dreamed of getting even with their boss? Actually, she said, killing their boss. And the organizers in the room all blanched and said, oh no, where are they going with this? And the workers all like erupted, right? So they knew the audience, they knew to make it a farce, not a drama. And because there was a movement behind it, it both informed it and then it was able to catapult the debate. So when millions of people then go into a comedy, these women with their boyfriends or husbands or girlfriends go into the movie theater and they laugh through a description of systemic discrimination and women banding together to combat it, they're in a very different place than they were when they started. So the movement was able to then take that and go much further than we would have without it.
And so one final thing. So this is the founder of 9 to 5. And one final thing I was going to ask Karen is, you all organized a 20-city tour of the film. And that did what to your membership?
Right, we then had a tour that we called The Movement Behind the Movie, and we went to 20 cities. I would go on the morning talk show where, you know, first there would be someone with the lost pets, and then there would be me, and then there was the recipe lady, and, you know, but, and then we would, you know, and I'd meet with the newspaper editorial board, and then at night we'd have 1,000 working women come out to some event. So we doubled the number of our chapters. We ended up with 20 new chapters all around the country. But more importantly, I think we changed consciousness across the board. It was just a wholesale change. Women who didn't even know what the word of discrimination meant before the movie, after the movie, just assumed that that was a factor, and the question is what you do about it.
So the other part of the question I was raising was about museums. And I'm really interested in you talking a little bit about the issues you raised in the book. And I mean, I've thought of museums in terms of what they represent ideologically and things that have been ripped off from other parts of the world, things like that. But you have a more, why don't you just tell us about museums?
So the first point I want to make is that museums are not neutral institutions. They each have messages that flow from them. In part, that's because you have curators doing a lot of the work, and every curator has their own viewpoint. And those viewpoints are expressed through the exhibition. So there is this notion somehow that museums are above the fray. They are, in fact, one of the most trusted institutions in America. Now, given the ratings of the Supreme Court and Congress these days, that's not a high bar. But nevertheless, they have what I think about as curatorial power, because they're able to deliver messages in a way that other people can't. And my sense about museums, I wanted to share two different tracks and also share a couple of slides about them. So museums will become and continue to become community action targets if they don't respond to the times. And I just want to share a few examples of that. This image that you're looking at is an image Nan Golden, the photographer, organized cultural institutions, organized protests at cultural institutions to demand that Sackler's name are pulled off the walls, pulled off the galleries. In the Tate in London, there was, until they pulled it down because of Nan's work, there was a plaque at an elevator saying the Sackler elevator. I mean, they are whitewashing, they are art washing, they are burnishing their reputations through their patronage of museums. And so museums, as we know historically, are governed by white men. They have historically shown white artist exhibitions and have historically had white staff. And that's beginning to change now. It's not changing fast enough by far, but it's beginning to change. Another example is the Koch brothers. David Koch was on the board of the Museum of Natural History in New York City. So everyone in this room knows who David Koch is. I don't have to explain who he is. But he is the largest climate denier in the world if you weigh it up against the amount of money he puts into climate denialism. So he's on the board. And imagine you're a curator that wants to do a show on climate change. Well, Koch doesn't need to open his mouth because you know right away that you're crossing a line. That's this major investor in the museum. So there were a series of organized demonstrations at the American Museum of Natural History regularly. And the cards are still out as to why he left. Some people said he was sick. Some people said it was his time. And some people said it was the protest. But it was the convergence, I think, of these things that led to him getting off of the board. And we saw the same thing with Warren Kanders. Warren Kanders is the guy whose company made the tear gas that was sent down to the US-Mexico border. He was on the board of the Whitney, the vice chair, off the board. So museums have become, and will continue to be community action targets if they're not responsive. And I want to talk about two hopeful museums. One is the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And this is a picture of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice just down the block. This was the work of Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative. Brian understands in his gut that art and culture are central to the way people think about things. And how many people have been down there, have seen this? So that's a good number. So for those of you who haven't, this is a monument, a memorial to the legacy of lynching. And there are 805 cork and steel beams that hang from the ceiling. And inscribed in each one of these coffin-like rectangles are the names of some of the people who have been lynched and the towns and counties in which the lynchings took place. But they did one more thing. There is not only an incredible memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, but the Legacy Museum made replicas of these. And they created a project called the Remembrance Project. And so if you're from Richmond, Virginia, and you see that one of your ancestors was hung in Richmond, you can take back a replica of this to Richmond and demand that there be a marker, something that recognized what happened, recognized the lynching. Or you could take back the replica and use it as another way to express white supremacy and to fuel legislative change, as was done in Colorado and several other places where they use this. And so it was the idea that museums can also be action-oriented. They could be forward-looking. They don't just look at the past. They don't just look at today. They can look to the future. And by the end of this talk, I'll get this clicker right. And the last point I want to make about museums is just a really important story that Vesela, who's a curator, would know, but she's shaking her head, so I'm not going to ask her to come up. So in the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, Breonna Taylor was killed. Ta-Nehisi Coates commissioned Amy Sherrill, who did the Michelle Obama portrait that's in the portrait gallery, to do a portrait of Breonna Taylor. And Amy said, I'll only do it if it can be shown in Louisville, which is where she was killed. And so the Speed Museum, which is the largest and oldest cultural institution in Kentucky, emptied out 4 galleries within 3 months. Now, those of you that know about museums know the exhibition runways, as they're called, are 3 to 5 years. These galleries were emptied out in 3 to 4 months. And what Stephen Riley, the director of the museum, did was, instead of tapping a curator to do a show, he put together 2 advisory boards. One was a national advisory board of artists whose family members were killed or maimed by the police. And the other was a local community advisory board made up of mental health advocates, legal advocates, economic development folks, a whole range of people. And the national board and the local board didn't always see eye to eye. The national board wanted 30 pieces of art that were reflective of the times. The local board said, yeah, but every one of the artists needs to be Black. And they fought about that. And that was just one of several issues that these boards fought about. But the important thing here is that the board, reflecting the communities, are who fought about this. So the curator, when the curator was brought in, did a show that reflected what the community thought. And Sadiqa Reynolds, who at that time was the head of the Urban League in Louisville, said, it was the first time my people ever felt comfortable walking into the Speed Museum. And now those communities use the museums. So museums can be a community building institution. They can be important partners because they have resources. And so organizers need to think about message, like museums are not neutral, how museums can advance the messages that they want to, and so forth. And I think I'll stop there on this end, at least, because of time.
And I want to add to that, what's it called, Candace? The Museum of Chicano Art that Cheech Marin did? Is that what it's called? It's in, yeah, in Riverside, California, which is exactly what you're talking about. And it's but it was, Cheech is very progressive. People may or may not know. And this is a really important intervention, particularly because Chicanos are being erased in the name of Latinos and Latinas. And so this is something that is a really important intervention. Let me ask you one more thing before we open it up. There's this thing that you raise in here, and I'm always interested in money. So this question of transformative philanthropy.
I knew that was going to get Bill's goat.
Oh, absolutely. It definitely has my attention. So what exactly is that? And how does it fit in with this?
Well, it fits in because there's cultural philanthropy, which has a sordid history in terms of who they have invested in. I mean, they mostly, originally, cultural philanthropists invested in elite art institutions and helped to define the value of art based upon the artists that they liked. And so the history of philanthropy that so irks Bill and me is that it's tied to a number of race, gender, identity, and class issues. And I wanted to write a section in the book about transformative cultural philanthropy to suggest that there is hope. And the best example of this that I could think of, that I talk about in the book, is the Art for Justice Fund. The story is that a philanthropist named Agnes Gunn, her friends call her Aggie, saw Ava DuVernay's film 13th and was blown away by it, and called up Darren Walker, who was president of the Ford Foundation, and said to Darren, we need to do something to end mass incarceration now. And Darren convened a meeting with Elizabeth Alexander, who now is the poet, who now is the head of the Mellon Foundation, and Brian Stevenson, and a few other people to figure out what they could do. And Aggie had an idea. In the early 1960s, she bought one of Roy Lichtenstein's paintings. It was called The Masterpiece. And while Roy is gone, her wife Dorothy is very much still on the art scene. And Aggie calls Dorothy and said to Dorothy, how would you feel if I sold Roy's painting? Because I want to raise money to end mass incarceration. And Dorothy loved the idea. And Aggie sold the painting for $160 million. 100 of that $160 million was used to create the Art for Justice Fund. And what's important about the Art for Justice Fund is that this is a philanthropy that takes its lead from the families of people who are incarcerated and the incarcerated themselves. So they're taking their lead from people who are closest to the ground, who know about this, who have snifters, who can sort out the wheat from the chaff. Is that the expression, wheat from the chaff? Yeah. Yeah. And so 30% of their funding went to families of incarcerated, 30% of $100 million. Actually, it became $125 million because so many artists like Mark Bradford and Julie Moretu and others began to contribute their art to this. So it was a new way to think about philanthropy. And there are new other formations, which we probably don't have time to talk about tonight, but I'd be happy to talk more about later, that are doing similar kind of things that are driven by the community, not driven by program officers who think they know what the best thing to fund is, whose program directors have to sign off, whose boards have to sign off on them.
Excellent. So we're going to open it up now to questions and comments, and we'll go for about 20, 25 minutes. And the name of that museum is the Cheech Marine Museum for Chicano Art and History. I want to highly recommend it if you're in California. So the floor is open. Questions or comments?
Don't be shy. Oh. First and foremost, Ken Grossinger, you have inspired me in more ways than you know. As you know, I have been the organizer, I've been the advocate, and an activist. I started out as an organizer at 1419 B Street, right across the street from here, which was called Washington Inner City Self-Help, under the leadership of Paul Battle, which is now Empowerment DC. After serving 17 years on the Board of Commissioners, I decided to rebrand myself and become an activist. As an activist, I use art too. I use art in the field that I'm a paralegal. And I work with a group of people such as Miss Lily, who sits across from me. What I do with the art with social change with kids in Ward 6 and 7 is I take their skills in a conversation and I have my kids describe to me what they see as social change. And this is very interesting because in Ward 6, we deal with Abaddon, Maury, John Towler. But in Ward 8, we deal with Eagle, and there's also an Eagle in Ward 6.
I'm going to have to ask you to.
I'm going to stop just one moment. What interested me tonight to come here to purchase a book was that one of my students decided, and she's only 10 years old, and she wanted to have a conversation about Trump. And I told her, because one of my jobs is to have them open up, to draw a picture. I'm going to make sure you get that picture. Thank you very much.
And thanks for your good work, Aquarius. Aquarius, when she said she was on the board for 17 years, meant the DC Housing Authority Board. She was one of 3 resident commissioners who were elected by the folks in the projects where she lives.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to mention, because I was in SNCC, as you know. So when I come in, I'm 19 years old, right? And it's November 1963.
And this is Judy Richardson.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My name is Judy Richardson, and I used to have, when a lot of the SNCC folks came back from the South, we did a bookstore called Drum and Spear right up at 14th and V Street. Okay, and then Drum and Spear Press, and okay, da-da-da-da. But the main thing was Danny Lyon, took a photo of us because Danny was our cell phone, right? We didn't have any cell phones then. So to prove that things were happening as you said they were happening, we had Julian Bond, who was our communications director. Again, culture, because he also was a poet, right? And so he does, check that thing, yes, what's his name? Atlanta. Oh, well, I won't even go because, again, it's past 6 o'clock and I've forgotten everything. Okay, so, but the main thing was, I have to do a culture. No. Can you hear me? Okay. What I would like to say is that Danny Lyon then takes a photo, for example, of us, and there's this one photo of me looking at on a sit-in, and I'm staring at the camera. That's Danny Lyon's photo, right? It's in the Atlanta airport. Danny was our cell phone, right? But the other part, okay, I'll keep it up here. Maybe I should do it up here. Okay, yes. Okay. What I really did want to mention, though, is stand up. Okay. Hello. Oh, golly. Yeah, that's good. Okay, fine. Just that the culture, in terms of SNCC, sorry, I don't want to get in your way. In terms of SNCC, the culture workers came out of the organizing of SNCC, right? They were not separate. So when you saw Bernice Johnson Reagan, yeah, she becomes one of those who helps found, although Chuck Neblett really started it, the SNCC Freedom Singers. But she's coming out of organizing in Southwest Georgia, right? She is one of the main people coming out of Albany State College. She's an organizer. Chuck Neblett, one of the other 4, is an organizer coming out of Cairo, Illinois. So we never saw, culture was part of SNCC's DNA, right? It was never separate. And certainly the freedom songs, Bill, when you were talking about We Shall Overcome, part of the problem was people always assumed that the tactic of nonviolence was the philosophical thing of nonviolence, right? That was the Nashville movement. And they were very good, and there was a point to that. But most of us at SNCC, by the time I get there as a 19-year-old in 1963, that's a tactic. And so we know that you're not going to respond because you're going to bring even more violence down on the community that you're trying to organize based on, you know, how do you get black people registered to vote without getting them killed? All right, so that's a tactic. But We Shall Overcome is then even in Eyes on the Prize, and I worked on all 14 hours of it. But what we focus on is the national movement, right? And what you see is young black people getting beat over the head and singing We Shall Overcome. And you see the young black guys also getting beat up, and they're not doing anything to help the young black women. Nobody wants to enter that kind of history. But if you see black people not just singing We Shall Overcome and getting beat over the head, but if you see them also singing Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round, right? And singing it at a jailer as they're taking you into the paddy wagon and singing it to him as if you can't do nothing to me because I'm not saying ain't gonna let nobody, you know, you're gonna do that. There is a force to that music, and there was always a force to the artwork and to the paintings, everything we did. The culture was part of our DNA. I would just also mention, in terms of the museums, I'm still in film, so I'm doing the film for the Frederick Douglass National Park Service site here in Southeast Washington. Finally, 38 years, the other film was up. It's now got a new film. All right. What I would say is the museums, the civil rights museums really are impressive, right? And it really, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the Birmingham, I thought it was just going to be about Dr. King. It's not. It's about the Selma to Montgomery National Park Service site. All of that is important. So I would just mention that as museums. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Yes, back there.
My name is Dan. I want to make a peculiar comment. I've known Ken and Micheline for quite a long time. We're all very progressive. But, you know, I believe that everybody should support art. Arts organizations need the support of citizens, of the government, and corporations, and rich people, all of those people. And I hate when there's a big brouhaha about ExxonMobil supporting something, or David Koch supporting something, or frankly, the Sacklers. The Sacklers were murderers. On the other hand, they loved art. They weren't trying to, when they started putting their names on art museums, they weren't trying to whitewash, or I forget what the artwash. They were trying to support art, and I think that's a great thing to do. Now, I love what Nan Golden did. I love what the Smithsonian did with the Sackler Gallery. They made it into the National Museum of Asian Art, and now the Sackler Gallery is just part of that. I don't mind Bill Cosby showing his art collection. You know, the man was a horrible person, yet he had a great art collection, or pretty good art collection, and we need to see it. We can't cancel everybody out of art because art costs money, and particularly in museums, but every place else. We have to welcome people, and we have to recognize that people are complex. They may be bad in some respects, but they can be very altruistic in others.
Got it. So let's explore this. So if you begin with the assumption, Ken, that all of the money is bloody, which is my assumption, then how do you make how and why make a distinction? responding to what the gentleman's raising, but also your own points.
So there is a contradiction here. There is no question about it. Museums and other cultural institutions do need investments. That's not just true within culture. It's true among a lot of different organizations. But you won't be surprised to find that I disagree with the idea that there's not an intention to art wash, because I believe there is. I believe there's a reason why the Sacklers put probably billions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into putting their names on this, because they were who they were, and they were trying to alter their reputation. So I think we have to grapple with intentionality, but we also have to grapple with your point, which is that we need funds to support these things. And I don't have an answer to this question. It's a question that's been dogging museums for a long time. I'm on a museum board, and we're constantly looking for sources of funds, and I'm constantly arguing we need to change the makeup of our board. And somebody comes along with a check, and my arguments often just go by the wayside. So we need to figure this out.
So I want to dig a little deeper, because I've been in countless discussions on the left about this issue of money. So nobody has it. And then what happens is money shows up and it's like, well, do you remember what they did in 1963? And maybe we shouldn't take that money, because what is it going to mean? And unless the money is coming from the Gambino family, what I want to know is, what are the strings that are attached? I'm less interested in the source of the money, because as I said before, my attitude is all of the money is bloody. Carnegie and all of them, they put their names on because they were just like slave owners who, right before they died, they wanted to do something so that God didn't throw them into hell. And Carnegie wanted his name on things so that God did not throw him into hell, and so that his family would be remembered as great people. We all know that. But money counts. So what do we do, Ken?
I'm going to write another book.
All right. Yeah, and I'm sorry, yes. Okay. Well, let's make sure that Andy, I don't know, I feel like I'm actually not on his payroll, but I definitely think that Andy's question should be the last one. But is there anyone else that wants to ask something really quick?
I'll answer the last one. We can take another one after this.
Okay.
But I just have a quick question. Why do you think the United States does not have a Department of Culture? Almost every country in the world has a Department of Culture or Ministry of Culture. When the Cuban Revolution happened, for instance, Castro was the first department he really put a lot of attention to was the Ministry of Culture, because he understood the power of culture and how it can bring a group together and for a common purpose, and how you can create really the kind of patriotism that they were trying to create at that time to support the revolution. But this country does not have that. Is it because it was done intentionally, or they just forgot?
I always lean towards intentionality. We do have a National Endowment for the Arts. We do have a National Endowment for Humanities, which puts hundreds of millions of dollars into art and culture. But they, to your point, Andy, and to your point, Bill, they come with strings attached. I remember being at a gala for the Smithsonian years ago when John Boehner was running the House of Representatives and threatened to cut the Smithsonian's budget in half if they didn't remove a piece of art. And so I do think that it's a quite an intentional decision, because I do think the right does know the power of art and culture, and they do whatever they can do. I mean, Reagan, not just Trump, Reagan, you can count the number of presidents. The first thing that's on the chopping block is the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for Humanities.
But is there always like that sense that art is going to lean to the left? Is that the idea? I mean, you know, if the money is coming from government, right? It means, yeah, there are strings attached, but it's attaching government for everything, State Department, whatever it is. But the National Endowment for the Arts, I mean, gets a paltry amount, right? I mean, how much is the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts from the government? I don't think it's much. I think it's definitely tiny compared to, let's say, any other department that gets billions. I mean, I think I have read it's like something like $90 million maybe that comes from the state. I mean, from the federal government. But the rest has to be raised by, you know, philanthropists and fundraisers and, you know, bake-offs and all that stuff to be able to make the difference, which is weird. I mean,
but I think, Andy, you have to link it to this country despises education, right? And so it holds education in contempt and counterposes so-called practical knowledge and practical ability to education, to thinking, to cultural exploration. And so I actually think that these things go together. Why does this country put so little into real education? I think is linked to this notion about culture. I don't think that the powers that be necessarily assume that culture is spontaneously something that's to the left. Any more than I think that they think that education is. It's just not a priority. It really goes to American pragmatism, philosophically. I mean, that's the way I would read it. So, look, I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking my friend Ken Grossinger. And we have a little bit of time here, so it's really important that there is a security person at the door that's not going to let you out unless you buy at least one copy of Ken's book. So I want to encourage us all to come forward, and Ken, I'm volunteering him, will of course autograph it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.